I am making this video for a friend of mine in my local flying club. He has just installed Blackbox, and this is one of his first logs. So you can consider this a good introduction for people who maybe aren't as familiar with Blackbox. I'm going to go back to some of the basics that I went over in my first set of videos, and just sort of do a general run through of what I see in his tune. The first thing I like to do if I am approaching something cold is I'm just going to look at your gyros. And the gyros are useful because they tell me how much overall vibration there is in the copter. If you have a copter with excess vibration, it's going to be hard to get a good tune. You're not going to be able to tune as tightly as you'd like to. The first thing to do is to see if you have excess vibration, and if you do, to see what you can do to get the vibration out of there as much as possible. And the way we do that is we bring up the gyros trace, and then we zoom all the way out, and we look at the overall thickness of the lines. And we can see here that these lines in general are not very thick. Something crazy is going on here. I don't know what it might be. But in general, the lines are not very thick at all. They're very thin. So this is a relatively clean and noise-free copter. Good, great. We just want to check. Now I'm going to zoom back out to 100%. The next thing I do is I start looking at the PID traces, and I'm going to look at the roll axis first. I like to do that because the roll axis is often the most active of the axes on a mini quad. The roll axis is usually, the mass is usually more centralized on the roll axis, and therefore the copter is more, has more oscillation on that axis than on the pitch axis. I see, and I'm going to look first at the general sort of activity level of the P term. How much is it oscillating? How big is the amplitude of its swings? How high is the frequency of its swings? And I'm going to look specifically for, like, if you look right here, let me just get the D term out of there real quick. Let me just make the D term disappear so you can see the P term more clearly. Look for cases where the P term starts to get sort of sharp and active and oscillating versus times like this. Here we see that the P term is sort of moving. I get these sort of waves, but it doesn't look like these sharp oscillating sort of mountains, if craggy mountains, right? These gentle waves are sort of okay, but these craggy mountains are starting to look like maybe those oscillations that we wouldn't want to see. And I see here that you've got some times when you go high throttle, and that's going to be especially telling. So as we raise the throttle here, what happens? Okay, so this here is, to me, a very, very clear indicator of excess P gain. And we can see that the P term is just jumping all over the place. And also, if we look at the gyro trace here, we can see that the gyro is moving pretty substantially here. So we saw that there was not excess noise, excess vibration on the copter by looking at the gyro traces, and now we can see that we're getting a lot of motion in the gyro and the P term is swinging around a lot. We could have a chicken and the egg question here. If there was a lot of noise in the gyro, the P term would swing a lot in response to it, but there isn't a lot of noise in the gyro. So the fact that the P term is moving so much here means your P gain on roll is higher than it needs to be. This, I think, is a very clear indicator that P gain on roll needs to come down, or depending on your copter, you may decide to use TPA to bring, if we only see these oscillations at high throttle, we could use TPA to bring the P term down only when the throttle goes up. But I happen to know that you're running the sort of latest rev of Betaflight, and that's probably not necessary to do. Probably just lower P term on roll. This kind of activity in the P term with these sharp spikes as you raise the throttle is a very, very clear indicator that P term is too high. And moving forward through the file, you can see that there's lots of cases where the P term starts being active like that. When the throttle's low, there's not a lot of activity. That's normal. But then even at moderate throttle, you can start to see those jumps happening. And that's, I don't want to see that. If we bring the D term back in, we can see that overall the D term is slightly lower in magnitude than the P term, lower in amplitude. It's hard to judge whether the D term is tuned correctly if the P term is slightly overtuned. Overall, it looks roughly proportional, so the D term is probably about right, but P should come down by a fairly substantial margin. Yeah, this is pretty overtuned P. So if P was at like 6.0, I would say take it down to like 4.5. If P was at like 4.5, I would say take it down to like 3.8. Take it down a pretty healthy chunk, like 0.5 or maybe 0.7, depending on where it's at, assuming PID controller 1. If you're using LuxFloat, of course, that's a different story. Okay, so let's go look at pitch then. We're going to look at the same thing, really. And what we usually find is that pitch is less overtuned than roll, and that is clearly not what we find in this case. So there's two things I want you to notice here. The first is the P term is super active as you raise the throttle, so its P gain is too high. But notice that on pitch, we also seem to see more activity and magnitude in the D term, and so D may be a little overtuned as well. D is just jumping all over the place here. Again, hard to judge if P is overtuned, so maybe hold back on changing D at this point. But again, P needs to come substantially lower on this, on pitch as well. And yaw. And yaw. Okay, so low throttle, throttle's going to come up. Notice that here, yaw is as soon as you start raising the throttle, even a little bit, like 1300, 1350, you immediately start to see these regular oscillations. And notice how different that is from right here, where we've got these sort of rolling waves, but you wouldn't call them sort of hard oscillations. Here we start to see what looks like a sine wave with oscillations, and that is P-term oscillation, and that's just the clearest sign you can get that your P gain is too high. Here we're seeing it as low as 1375 on the throttle, and of course as the throttle gets higher, it gets really crazy. This is awful, really, here. Way too much P gain here, way too much. I mean, I would wonder if you were banging the throttle banging the copter on a table if I didn't know you were flying. And if you look here, take a look at your motor traces here. We call these angry Pac-Mans. I'm going to play it forward really slowly. And notice that the motors are banging from like 25% to full and then back again. I'm going to play it forward really slowly. And boom, 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 boom. See what they're doing there? Like Pac-Man eating dots, right? That is it's hurting the copter stability, and it's working the motors harder than they need to be worked. It's making a lot of heat. It's working your ESCs harder than they need to be worked, and it's just overall not a sign of a good tune. Let's just take a quick look at your motors trace so you can see what that looks like in the motors. Here's a nice motors trace. Nothing to complain about here. The motors are all doing their thing, right? The motors are all working. The lines are relatively close together. And then as we get into this high throttle scenario, whoa, the motors are just flipping out. This is not a copter that's going to fly well. And they're flipping out some more. Not going to, oh, it's this, see, this is not going to make for a happy flight experience. Okay, so knock your P gains down a little bit on roll, more on pitch, and even more on yaw. Like imagine your yaw P gain is 10, take it down to 7, something like that. All right, that's just sort of the most basic thing you can do to start getting your tune roughed in, is get your P gains correct. And then from there you can start looking at D. You can start looking at D, where you want to see D being roughly proportional to P and sort of following P along in lockstep, if you will. So here we've got a case where D is not as high amplitude as P. I'm not criticizing that or judging that. I'm just pointing it out as an example. Whereas here, for example, we have a case where D is sort of following P. It's kind of about the same amplitude and frequency, and that's kind of what we want to see, except that, of course, P is way too active here. But they're roughly proportional, and that's what we'd like to see, just with less overall activity. Okay, well, there's a sort of a basic, that's the first thing you got to work on, and then there's no point in trying to tune it anymore until you get those things sort of roughed in a little better. So that's where we'll stop, and as always, happy flying.